I'm Chris Hamilton. I'm founder of Hamilton Education. If you're joining me tonight, I'm going to be talking about the digital SAT. Tonight's presentation is entitled Decoding the Digital SAT, How to Hack the New Digital SAT. I'm using the word hack just to be clear in the MIT sense. If you visited MIT, I imagine many of you have, you get to hear about famous hacks. When MIT talks about a hack, they don't mean someone stealing data or someone trying to trick you through social media. They mean finding a clever way, an elegant way of solving a problem. And so I'm using the word hack in that sense to talk about the new digital SAT. College Board released the new digital SAT in March of 2024, just a few days ago. We have heard from some of our students who took it, students we prepared to take the test. The new test is entirely online and is adaptive. So I want to explain that a little bit. This is sort of misunderstood. It's adaptive in that when you take the first math section, for instance, it is designed to be kind of medium in difficulty. And if you do well, if you do roughly 70% correct, you will advance to a section that will be harder, and you will find these questions are more difficult. If you didn't do well on the first module, you're routed to a different math test. Now, I've seen, especially in conservative newspapers, comments along the lines of, what in the world? People are losing their heads, like different questions. Some people get easier questions. Okay, yes, the adaptive element means some people will get easier questions in the second module, but if you get the easier module, you can only get a 600 on your math score. So you get easier questions, but you also can't get the same score that you would get if you were sent into the harder module with harder questions. The same is true for the reading and grammar module. Being adaptive isn't really what troubles me about the new digital SAT. Being adaptive actually makes a certain amount of sense. You don't answer all of the range of questions and difficulty. People who are strong will really mostly focus on the harder questions and they can get a better score. People who are less confident don't have to struggle through those questions. And the scores will be reflecting what level of difficulty you're addressing. There are rumors about the test that it'll be easier because it is shorter, that the test is in some way, a sop to a loss of standards. I don't think those things are correct. We'll talk in a bit about some things that I think are true about the digital SAT. We spent a great deal of time and money preparing for this new test. We've got a new digital platform. Our students can take the test online just as they will on a College Board day. And I'm excited. It's been difficult, not impossible, but difficult for us at Hamilton to work with students in New York and Connecticut and Texas with the digital SAT. It's not unusual for us it wouldn't be a strange thing to say, hey, let us work with you. We're what many people consider the best in the nation. So all that is good, but I'm still not really won over by the test. I think you could perhaps call it a TikTok test. For instance, the new digital SAT to fit on a screen doesn't have reading passages anymore. It has what we might call reading paragraphs. I would argue the new digital SAT is really meant for a generation who read and write primarily on their phones. There's a number of psychologists that have convincingly suggested that this generation that lives on a screen, they may be unhappy and impacted in terms of their learning by spending so much time on screens. I'm not sure it's a great idea for the College Board exam to be so thoroughly anchored to screens, to be so connected to screens that there's no more reading passages. But that's the way of the world. I worry that arguments that have long been, I think, very unpersuasive and weak, that the SAT is irrelevant. Research suggests nothing could be further from the truth. The SAT and ACT are, frankly, the single best metric of whether you will do well in college. Grades go up and down depending on your rigor of your school. Besides, no college has ever used just the SAT as a metric. But there are colleges now using just GPA, which we know is a much weaker predictor. I worry that a test that has students read only one paragraph, it may not tell us who's exactly ready to be reading philosophy or political science at UCLA or Harvard. A philosopher, a Canadian philosopher named Marshall McLuhan in the 1960s argued that a generation raised, he was thinking of TV screens, raised on screens, will change the way they view the world and themselves. The medium, he said, is the message. And I think in some ways, he's proven to be a far-sighted thinker. And I'm seeing him brought up more in contemporary media because the regime of the screen, it's not really the case that you can turn it off. It can turn you off. The classic SAT, the one that I taught for years, offered what were called passages, about 800 words of coherent essay or story. So this is a classic example of what we used to teach. And this is what you will find on the current ACT, which is one reason why we strongly encourage kids to keep that test as part of their strategy. You would have to understand the voice tone of this passage, understand rhetoric, how it's organized, and something called working memory, where you have to read something, keep it in your mind for 10 or 15 minutes, and then read something else and compare them. Working memory is pretty much what all of us do in our professional lives. Doctors, lawyers, professionals have to keep at least two things and think about their relationship for a long enough period of time to understand what that relationship might be. Those elements are generally gone from the digital SAT. So it has a single paragraph. Here's a pretty good example. You read this paragraph and answer this question: which choice best states the main idea? Now, if you're not good at understanding the main idea, this will still be difficult. But this observation that the SAT, the digital SAT, has shorter passages has led some teachers and counselors to suggest that the SAT is now going to be easier because it's shorter. I probably don't need to tell most of you. I think these claims suggest a deep misunderstanding of how standardized tests actually work. If a DMV, a driver's license test, was easier, you don't have to parallel park, you might not have to address some hypothetical situation, more people will pass. The SAT and ACT are not like a driver's license test. They are not pass-fail. They put people on a Gaussian curve. And so I sometimes don't mean to embarrass anyone, but in the last month or two, I've asked students with their parents, what percentage do they think on the new SAT, what percentage of students will end up in the top 1%? And parents are sometimes a bit amused, sometimes a bit frustrated when kids occasionally puzzle over this question, like what percent will be in the top 1%? But the answer is in the question itself. The new digital SAT, as short as it is, it's almost an hour shorter than the ACT. Short passages, 1% will be in the top 1%. So there are elements of difficulty that are introduced to the digital SAT, and we're going to talk about them tonight and talk about ways of overcoming them, working through them. So rather than asking students to comprehend nuanced arguments, the SAT introduces difficulty in less straightforward and more sneaky ways. But again, this is where we can sort of hack the digital SAT. And My team, we have created many new digital SATs. We've taken them, we've edited them. We know this test pretty well. My first hack is pretty obvious, but it is practice. We've created a new digital platform and we have many new tests. In fact, we have more than a dozen new digital SAT exams that students can practice with. We usually want in the summer for students to practice with 8 SAT, ACT exams. We have, including the SAT and ACT, we have 3 times the number of tests that you would need, in our opinion, to study. But we also have thousands of practice problems that you can use. The new test is going to be very sensitive to practice, but also to the mastery of fundamentals of reading, grammar, and math. Speed. One sort of hack for the digital SAT is that the new test, in almost everyone's opinion, is going to feel slower to most students. This can be advantageous. One hack is to understand if you're struggling with time, the SAT is something you should sort of have in your arsenal. But honestly, in most cases in our office, it's a very small number of students who struggle mightily with time or with the clock. Most of our students do better on the ACT. They don't think they'll do better on it. They are skeptical of it. They have a cousin in Ohio who took it. They think the SAT must be, I don't know, a more favored test. But for reasons we'll discuss later, most of our students do better on the ACT. Still, it's good to have an option for students whose primary anxiety is the clock. From 2016 to just a few days ago, the SAT was really, in its form, almost identical to the ACT. I would say now the content, the ideas are very similar for the SAT, but the way that they're presented to you, the SAT gives you more time per question. This will help some people. It's very important to know this. Instead of know your grammar, the new digital SAT places reading and grammar questions together in a single module. It's not a separate section any longer. It's going to be impossible to do well on this test without a thorough understanding of grammar. Since grammar hasn't been taught widely in American high schools since 1968, formal study of grammar is important, as is knowing what kinds of grammar questions the test favors. Hint, it focuses particularly on punctuation and ways of linking independent and dependent clauses. If that sounds like nonsense, you got to go back and study the basics of grammar. So instead of asking, I would say, meaningful questions about grammar, some of which are quite contentious. Some people would argue that there's kind of no such thing as correct grammar. Others, I mean, I've got graduate degrees from UCLA and taught English there for many years. I would argue the conventions of grammar change over time. It's important to understand what they are now and what they are in different contexts. The SAT, the new SAT focuses mostly on punctuation, but you need to know punctuation is different in the US compared to the rest of the English-speaking world. So here's an example. In her analysis of Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth, 1905, scholar Candace Wade observes that the novel depicts the upper classes of New York society as, quote, consumed by the appetite of a soulless materialism, is apparently the word here, an apt assessment given that The House of Mirth is set during the Gilded Age, a period marked by rapid industrialization, economic greed, and widening wealth disparity. So I'm asking you, how would you link this clause that introduces this paragraph, or rather sentence, and would you use a semicolon? Would you use a comma? Do you not need a comma at all? Would you use what we call a true conjunction, which is and is one of the fanboys for and, nor, but, or, yet, so. But interestingly, at least to me, choice A shows you a semicolon, which would not be correct with an and after it here. But in England, in India, in most countries outside of the United States, choice A, having a semicolon outside of the quotes, would be correct. And in the United States, and really only in the United States, choice C is correct, putting the comma, putting any punctuation inside the quotes. Your student has to be taught these conventions. When they know them and even know what the conventions are in England, they'll be well prepared to get potentially a perfect score on this test. But you do need to understand these rules of grammar. I mean, it's weird to say that learning grammar is a hack, but it's going to be a hack on this test. Vocabulary. College Board removed nearly all vocabulary questions from the SAT in 2016. With the digital SAT, it's come roaring back. It's come roaring back because if the questions, the paragraphs are shorter, you've got to have something that divines the limits of what students can do with reading. And so they've introduced now quite a bit of vocabulary into the new digital SAT. It's about 18% of the SAT reading writing score. Any of you that know that know me from way back, 2012, 2013, you'll know we had a t-shirt that said, keep calm and study vocab. Vocab used to be tremendous component of studying the SAT. In my experience, there's two ways to deal with vocab on the SAT, two ways to hack vocab. One is to learn roots and etymology. So when the SAT was less focused on vocab, it would ask mostly secondary meanings or idiomatic phrases. We would teach students what we call the 90-10 rule. That means 90% of the time, if you know a root or an element of a word, you know enough to probably make a pretty good guess. So I went to for just a few years, went to a snotty school that taught Latin in 6th, 7th, and 8th. And so I can tell students, if you see a word and it starts with ad or odd in Latin, that means to or toward. It's a preposition. And if you see a word that begins with ab, you can be pretty certain that at least 90% of the time, it's going to have something to do with away. So I have students try this out. You might think you don't know what an adjunct professor is. You probably do. It's a professor who's been added to the ordinary faculty. You're not sure what it means that something says it's adjacent. It's next to, because AD means to or toward. I ask students to consider AB, away, absent, abolish. You don't want to be king anymore. You don't want to be queen. You abdicate your throne. We usually have some kid talk about abduct. You don't listen to your parents. Someone says there's puppies or candy in a van. You're being literally carried away. Abduct, carry, AB, away. You can work on vocab by learning how words are built, and sometimes you find surprising things. So when I put on a board these 4 words, radical, eradicate, I guess it's not really a word, radical, for, and radish. My writing's pretty bad. Students puzzle over it at first. They're not really sure what these roots are telling them, but eventually they'll figure out, okay, radical political change is trying to go to the roots. And if you eradicate, you want to pull something up by its roots. And radical 4 is, of course, the square root of 4. And radish is sometimes a puzzler. Usually one student will tell me, it's a root vegetable. Anything with rad means root. And 90% of the time, you're going to be fine just looking at a word, asking what pieces of it do I understand. Another way, this is what we're doing this summer, is we're going to have a digital version of these flashcards. You can learn about 2,000 vocabulary words. If you are in the running for a perfect score on the new SAT, or even a score in the top 1%, a serious hack for this test is going to be learning vocab. And We have digital flashcards and digital games. You can even kind of challenge other students around the country with their vocab knowledge. I will say this, either way, whether you're learning vocab by consulting a list and trying to learn 50 words a day, you're learning vocab by thinking about roots. Kids who don't read or don't put in the work are not going to do well on this component of the test. An old school hack, studying vocabulary words, is going to pay big dividends on this test. In the old days, almost everyone in my office, these students would look at these words, and by the end of the summer, they would know what equivocate means, supercilious, maybe despair is something they'll learn in grad school. Equivocate, equivoke, speaking equal sides of your mouth. Supercilious, the Romans called your eyebrows cilia. In fact, when we talk about cilia, we almost always mean little hairs. Supercilious means above the eyebrow. Supercilious means that kind of look. You are looking down on someone. You feel superior. I tell students, mostly boys, if you see a girl looking at you that way, it means the answer to will you go to prom with me is not yes. So on the new SAT, here's a typical, very common question. Its role isn't blank. Given the formation's greater prevalence among whales known to make deeper dives, some researchers hypothesize that its role isn't blank. Rather, the accessory spleen may actively support diving mechanisms. To answer this question, you could eliminate some of the choices because they just don't make sense. But you also can know that latent means hidden, or in some sense, sleeping, and active is the opposite. When we're told that it isn't blank, rather it is active, we can be pretty certain latent is the right word. Another hack for the digital SAT is to understand what's tricky. The SAT is shorter than the SAT. It gives you more time per question, but the SAT introduces difficulty in different sneaky ways. Understanding these is a hack. I would even say the typical distinction between the SAT and ACT is that the ACT is faster but more straightforward, and the SAT is a little slower but trickier. That's even more pronounced, that different path to creating difficulty. It reminds me, some of the questions on the digital SAT remind me of being in the first grade and an older kid said, I got a question for you, a test. And he said, okay, you're the bus driver. And then he goes through a long litany of 4 people get on the bus, 3 more get on the bus. I'm doing all the math in my head. 4 more get on the bus, 3 get off, then 2 more get off, then 7 get on. I'm trying to run the math. And at the end of it, as I think I've got a number in my head, the older kid says, who's the bus driver? And I thought, I don't know who the bus driver is. And of course, if I had been thinking, the original moment of that began with, you're the bus driver. And I think I got punched in the arm or something. Look at this question. This question shows a pretty simple histogram. Average number of individuals reporting directly to CEOs, average number of individuals directly reporting CEO. And it's got dates and managers and department leaders. And then we've got which choice best describes the data from the graph to support the researcher's conclusion. Now, if you just look at the data and look at the questions, I think we'll agree, I mean, unless you're, just utterly mind blank by this, that D, the average number of department leaders reporting directly to their CEO, rose over the 3 periods studied. That's definitely true. Here's another answer choice, though. The average number of department leaders reporting directly to their CEO was greater than the average number of managers reporting directly to the CEO. Okay, department leaders are in sort of dark black, in a kind of lighter charcoal. Managers. C is correct, too. It's the SAT. You can't just pick the answer that you like. This is pretty sneaky. You've got to go back and read the question stem researchers supporting the researchers' conclusions. Their conclusions were that across the years analyzed, there's a growing interest among CEOs in connecting with more departments in their companies. C is the answer choice that seems to support that conclusion. More departments in their companies rather than just D, which is one of those elements. You're going to have to practice that. You're going to have to train your mind to understand what kind of question you're being asked. The math portion of the new digital SAT, I have spoken to some people who literally work for College Board, who've been consultants, and they tell me the same thing my math faculty tells me in the office, that the math is itself basically the same math, but because the ACT has slightly higher level of difficulty of math, it's got more pre-calc in it. The SAT introduces difficulty by doing some sneaky things, lots of fractions and unsimplified expressions. This is a hack. If you learn that this is the way difficulty is introduced, you will be more confident. I also should mention, and I think this cuts against the argument that the new SAT will be in some way more equitable. First of all, equitable is a very strange word, and equity is a strange concept in light of a test that is measuring individual mastery. There's almost no way the test could tell us everyone has equal mastery. We have different backgrounds and different skills, and some of us work harder than others. But I would point out some of us, people that go to Westview, people that go to CCA, are pretty familiar with sophisticated graphing calculators. The SAT on the math section gives everyone access to a digital calculator called Desmos. And if you know how to use it, it's a tremendous advantage. I can easily imagine kids, though, whose math backgrounds or math offerings are less rigorous, less robust, and they are not familiar with graphing calculators. In that case, having access to a graphing calculator on a digital SAT right on the screen will not help you very much. In general, the SAT and ACT will benefit students that come from rigorous school systems. We're very good at test prep. I've got 213 kids who've earned perfect scores in the last 9 years. They would, I hope, agree. But the real work is what you're mastering in school. We're just simply putting those pieces together. One of the most important hacks I can share with you, I'm really trying to be quick so I can answer questions. I'll answer questions as many as I get. The most important hack is to take both tests, to study for both tests. If you attend a rigorous high school, it's 100% to your advantage to take one or both of these tests. Your grades will not set you apart from other candidates. Something numerous Ivies have admitted recently. You need only pick up a newspaper to see Dartmouth, Brown, MIT, now UT Austin, Yale, all telling the same story. We can't know who's going to be successful in our institutions just looking at grades. I strongly recommend studying for both the SAT and ACT. I admit it is counterintuitive because the skills they measure are 95% similar, even though the tests look and feel different. One's shorter, but harsher on missed questions. If you miss one question on the SAT, your score will drop precipitously. On the ACT, if you miss one question here, one question there, you will be getting a perfect score on the ACT. In fact, someone in the office created this for me today. I think this Venn diagram captures the relationship between the SAT and ACT quite accurately. All of the skills of the SAT, except for a tiny slice, are contained within the ACT. If we train you for both, in our efforts to train you for the ACT, you will know all of the rules of grammar to answer 75 questions about grammar. The roughly 25 to 30 questions about grammar on the SAT will contain some of those, but it won't be possible to predict which. If we teach you all of the notions of grammar, you will be prepared for the SAT. Everything we want to teach you for both tests will cover the SAT. If we can help you run a marathon, we can absolutely help you run half marathon. In this tiny little section that I've labeled the vocabulary, that's where the tests don't intersect. And so we've built online digital vocabulary tools to supplement the in-class work that we'll be doing this summer. I can promise you for almost 2 decades, I've had students complain about learning vocabulary. They didn't want to learn vocabulary. They didn't want to learn SAT words. And when I meet students, even just a few years out of college, they'll often tell me, I didn't realize that what I thought were SAT words were just words. Were just words. The history of the tests is relevant in understanding why I want most of our students to study for both. The SAT was designed to admit people to Ivies, and it was designed from the get-go to figure out who is in the top 1%. The ACT was originally created in 1959 to admit people to the University of Iowa. It was originally like a driver's license test, measuring just competency. It was practically pass or fail, more or less. But when the ACT had ambitions to be a nationwide test, it needed to provide schools like Berkeley and Harvard and Yale with an assessment of where on a percentage a student fell. They could have either redesigned the test and created harder items to make sure that 99% of the people wouldn't be able to answer certain questions, or they did the simpler thing. They sped up the test. So that is a big secret that I'm sharing with people. I've shared it many times. The ACT wasn't meant for East Coast and West Coast students. It wasn't meant for students who are in the very most competitive high schools. And for many, many decades, hardly anyone got a perfect ACT. In 2017, 17 kids in Nebraska got perfect SAT, ACT test scores, 17. In 2017, in our office, it looks like we had about 28 just in the office. And before we started teaching the ACT alongside the SAT, there were 5 students in San Diego County in 2015 who got perfect scores on the ACT. Here are their pictures. 2 of them are our students. I made this just 2 weeks ago. It's now 213. We've had 4 students get perfect scores just in the last week. And I want to show you the students whose perfect scores are from the ACT, a test that many people think they don't want to take. It's 87%. So a really important hack is prepare for both tests. Have some backup batteries on an airplane, for a device, and prepare for 2 tests. There's little doubt that taking these tests in whatever form is advantageous for most students. Who is it not advantageous for? Students that go to weaker schools, who have not been prepared well for college work. It would be better not to take these tests. For students that go to rigorous schools, the data is overwhelming. David Leanhart wrote a piece in the New York Times that is kind of earth-shattering. It's just from 2 months ago. It basically says almost everything you've heard about the SAT being a bad measure or being unfair is dead wrong. And we're now hearing it, shock, from Ivy League presidents. Christina Paxson, the president of Brown, standardized test scores are much better predictors of academic success than high school grades. This is Brown, hippy-trippy Brown, Yale has said the same thing, MIT, Dartmouth, UT Austin. More are sure to follow. This is important. In 2020, in the season of 2020 to 2021, I heard countless people advising. I can still go on YouTube and find them right now, still saying, oh, you don't want to send in your scores unless they're really good, or don't send in your scores at all. Don't take the test. Nobody cares. This is simply not true. Almost all of the data suggests that even if your scores are not good, below the 25th percentile, those students were accepted at a greater rate than those who didn't submit scores. When we look at what we found a couple of years ago, 70% of students admitted to Ivy League, Ivy Plus submitted scores. In my office, of the 30, 40, 50 students in last year who got into Ivy Plus schools, it was 100% who submitted scores. I asked Purdue just a week or two ago a question, what percentage of students that you accepted in the last year submitted scores? The answer from the admissions officer at Purdue was 97%. 97% of accepted students at Purdue submitted scores. If someone on YouTube or someone in your school is telling you that colleges don't want them or that they don't matter, these people are not reading. They're not reading newspapers. And I will tell you, it troubles me that the SAT, the new digital SAT, suggests that reading a paragraph, something you could read on your phone, is reading. Because to understand how we can admit people in a fair and equitable fashion, it's not something that you can debate or think about in one paragraph. The world is not to be understood by one paragraph. If you read newspapers, you will see a new consensus that testing students is the most fair way, and the trend is a tiny, tiny slice will be admitted without submitting test scores. It's very likely, if you're watching this webinar, that you're not in that 3%. If we look at the Wall Street Journal, they're telling the story about how with test optional, high-profile Ivy Plus schools were inundated with applications, which led to lower acceptance rates, which made students churn out even more applications, which led to a further vicious circle of acceptance rates dropping even further. In light of this competition, Wall Street Journal says many applicants and college counselors have remained skeptical of just how optional the tests really are. A pretty good inference would be they were never really optional. Dartmouth said on its admissions site last year that applicants wouldn't be judged on whether they included their SAT or ACT score. But in other interviews recently, Dartmouth has said, we rejected many students who, if we had just known that they had a 1400 on their SAT, we would have accepted them. I would say if you're in certain groups, a 1400 will do it. If you are my typical student, that will not do it. But not submitting a score is not the right path. Not submitting a score is taking the Fifth Amendment. It is not a good inference that colleges will draw. I'm going to ask you to consider for a moment a college and career counselor at El Dorado High School in Albuquerque. She says she used to provide families with lists of tutors to help teens study for the SAT. Now, she says, almost nobody asks for them. So few people put any effort into prepping for it anymore, Velhagen said. The University of New Mexico and New Mexico State University are both test optional. Hagen said she tries to remind students, especially those looking out of state, about potential admissions advantages and scholarships tied to strong scores. I'm going to end on this note. Wealthy people, investors, institutional investors look for inefficiencies in the marketplace. They look for an asset that people do not yet realize is valuable or important, but soon will. And they take advantage of that gap between some knowing of its value and then in the future, others knowing. An example of this inefficiency in the marketplace that you can take advantage of is preparing for and doing well on the SAT and ACT. If what this article suggests is true, and I see a lot of evidence that it is, that people don't really get it. They're taking colleges at their word when colleges say, you will not be disadvantaged. They are disadvantaged. We had double digits get into Stanford last year. One of my students I spoke to just the other day told me he reviewed through Freedom of Information Act his Stanford application. They mentioned his test scores. They mentioned his ACT being perfect, and they mentioned his AP scores. This is a CCA student who's a sophomore at Stanford. They mentioned his test scores in the midst of a moment where they're telling the rest of the world they don't matter. I'm going to remind everyone, obviously, we are a business. We are open for business. We have put a lot of effort into building a digital platform to make sure that students can take the digital SAT just as they will take it on the real test day. By the way, you don't take it at home. You have to go to a school and bring your computer, which is, I would say, another blind spot in the digital SAT. If you had to view Netflix by taking your computer into Sinopolis, it would change, I think, the business model of Netflix. College Board has some odd ways of thinking. I also would remind people we are just beginning this week classes that will help people master, put together all the pieces of their AP coursework to express it on an AP exam. When Stanford, through a Freedom of Information Act request, allows you to look at your app, and you see that one of the things they talked about extensively was your test scores, your APs. It's very difficult to suggest that those things don't matter. So I've shared a number of quirky insights about the digital SAT. I want to remind you, of course, the reason that we have an H3 model, we teach the SAT and ACT together, is most people don't realize the overlap, the striking overlap of skills. And most people don't realize that for many of our students, the ACT will be the surest path to a perfect score, 10 times more likely for students to achieve a perfect score. I want to make sure we're teaching the SAT, though, because it links to the PSAT, which can earn scholarship money. And I will have some students who struggle with the timing of the ACT. I am going to see what questions, if any, we have. Does this include info on the PSAT? It will right now. The digital SAT was first tested in October of 2023 via the PSAT. The PSAT and digital SAT are identical tests, but they change the scale of the PSAT to distinguish the tests. And here's some good news. Our students who took the digital PSAT in October, even though we didn't then have a digital platform to teach that exam, of the 8 or 9 who've reported their PSAT scores to us, about a third of them got a perfect PSAT score. So again, that lends some support to my notion that this is what we're doing is a good fit for the digital SAT. The PSAT only matters in the 11th grade because only in the 11th grade is the PSAT what we call the NMSQT, the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test. Um, that is my answer to does this include info on the PSAT? Just want to see if we have any other questions or anything in chat or in the Q&A. You're welcome to send any questions you may have my way. I'm trying to think of any unasked questions that some people have had. Looks like we have one here. What grade? Excellent question. The short answer for what grade is the best to start preparing for the SAT, a very important question. The short answer is after you finish 10th grade and before 11th grade. That summer, if you're finished with 10th and going into 11th, is almost always the best because students have usually finished algebra 3, 4. They finished often IM2 or IM3. In some cases, they finished calculus. If you get further along in math, you're too far past the relevant math on the SAT and ACT. The highest level of math on any of these tests is a little bit of pre-calculus on the ACT. The SAT is even more modest in its range. That time, 10th and 11th in that summer is good because often students have more time. They're not usually focused on some kind of major passion project in that time span. Also, 11th grade is often the most demanding academic year. For many students, it'll be, without a doubt, the toughest. I don't want them studying for the SAT and ACT in the middle of the school year, and I don't want them studying when they're taking the second year of calculus, when even the first year of calculus isn't on the test. So the short answer is between 10th and 11th. The long answer, I would say, is it's usually that, but you'd want to be mindful of what math level the student is at. If a student has crushed calculus at the end of ninth and they read, they could study the SAT between ninth and 10th. I've had many perfect scorers who follow that pattern. For students who I think should wait a little bit, if they're behind in math, we might study during the 11th or even the summer after 11, but that's getting a little close to when you have to actually send in scores. Oh, you can absolutely take a prep course before taking pre-calculus. Someone's asking that question. I would say if you haven't finished integrated math 2, you should wait. You should wait. And if you have any questions at all, well, it's a little more complicated. Unlike pretty much any other company in the world, we want to meet with every individual student personally for at least 45 minutes so we can talk about these questions. I want to know, Mr. Pilliser, who works for me, who's brilliant, we want to know, where is your student? Are they really ready for this? Is this the right time? I've just been on LinkedIn going back and forth with a student who, he's in his 30s now. He went to Harvard. I remember the first meeting we ever had, I told his parents this was too soon. He was a ninth grader. And then in 10th grade, we met again, and I said, this is the right time. And it turned out it was the right time. Someone is asking something I've heard. Have you heard that the second math section, the second module of the digital SAT, was particularly hard? I have. I'm trying to dig into it and meet with students without pushing them to reveal anything I shouldn't know about the test. I want to make sure I'm not violating any confidences. But yes, I have heard that. And I would also say that's not surprising because the SAT is competing with the ACT, and they're trying, like a carnival game, to make it look like it's got to be the easiest thing in the world. But anyone can tell you the test has to produce a normal distribution curve. And so I was probably the least surprised person to hear, oh my gosh, all the practice questions that College Board gave the world, the second module had harder elements than College Board had shared with them. Some students they might not have had this in their vocabulary, but they described essentially a bait and switch. This is another reason why I like preparing students for two tests when they're 95% similar. We're trying to dig into that. The test will be graded. The test will be finished probably in about 7 to 10 days, and then we'll see. Can students take the test on their own school Chromebook? If so, will it slow them down versus other devices? Okay, I've got people in my office who could answer that. I'm going to say my email is ch@hamiltoneducation.com. I'm going to ask my nerdy computer people. I'm pretty sure you can take it on your school Chromebook. Will it slow you down? It's really, I'm just trying to think about the processing speed of a Chromebook. I got to ask a higher level of nerd than myself. Someone's asking about the extension course, and I think what they mean is in what I'm going to call the old days before 2016, the SAT was only given in October, November, December, in January, and then there were 3 administrations in the spring. The test was not given in August. The test was not given in July. And back then, students would be very anxious that they would learn confidence and skills and techniques and strategies over the summer. And then the first chance to deploy that on a real SAT would be October. And so back then, the extension courses, what we call fall extension, they were very popular. We would meet usually for 6 or 7 Saturdays for a half day, just to kind of have a little refresher to keep you in shape for the test. The wisdom is still there. It's just a little less pressing. The fall extension classes are tremendously helpful for students who know they need to just do a little bit of practice. And like my wife and I, they know, there's a gym near where we live. We don't go unless a trainer makes an appointment. Actually, I went the other day, but mostly we don't. The fall extension is giving a structured way of studying the SAT and ACT in the fall so that you are ready in September and October, not only for the PSAT, which can be tremendously important in the lives and financial lives of students and families, but also for the SAT in October and the September ACT. The fall extension classes are designed to fit into a school schedule. They're making minimal demands of students' time, but acknowledging if you do nothing, if you don't prepare at all from early August until October, you will go backwards. So we make resources available. I think students should plan on taking the SAT and ACT, and my considerable experience, look at this gray hair, they should plan on taking the tests in the window, if they're well prepared over summer, in August and September and October. This gives us November and December before the skill set and familiarity with the tests is deteriorating. And it could mean before school really starts, before APs are really just charging along, students could often in August and September be done. So I would say earlier in the 11th grade school year is when they should take them. There are exceptions. We'll meet people sometimes at different moments in their academic path, and we may make a different schedule. But for most students in the summer, they sleep more, they're more rested, they are better candidates for us to teach them how to think in reading and writing and math. Someone's asking, do colleges require all scores submitted, or can students select scores? This is a bit complicated. I'm going to try to make it as simple as I can. The ACT, you can control 100% what test scores are sent where. You could take the ACT 6 times and you could send just one of those, and no college will know that you took it the other 5 times. The ACT will let you put 2 tests together and make a super score, a composite score, if you get a 36 from putting together 2 separate dates. It's one reason I like the ACT. The SAT um, will sometimes do that. It depends on the college policy. The ACT has long viewed students and families as consumers and as their boss, and the SAT views colleges as their consumer. So the SAT says it depends on the college policy. I will say, even though Yale has a policy that says we want to see all of your SAT scores, in a conversation with Yale years ago, an admissions officer said, I'll tell you why we want to see all the scores, because kids hide elements of an SAT they think we won't like, but in doing so, they may hide an element that would have produced a bigger overall super score average. And then he said, we got to report those to US News. You might not think 10 or 20 points would matter much, but he said a 7-point increase in average SAT of accepted students can affect our US News ranking. It's a while back, more than 10 years ago, but a dean at Claremont McKenna named Richard Voss, he manipulated US News SAT score averages for Claremont McKenna. He manipulated them by 13 points. 13 points. That's a tiny amount for an SAT score. But in doing so, he improved Claremont McKenna's US News ranking profoundly. When it was revealed, when it was discovered, he was fired. Um, I would say even when colleges want you to report all scores, they don't ask because they're looking for hidden weaknesses. They ask because they want to create the highest possible average to report to US News. I'm looking, I think that's the last of the questions I see. If there are no more, I'm going to thank everyone, of course, for your time. I'm excited about the digital SAT in many ways. It means I know that we can now work with students all over the country and across the world with the incredible team that I've built over the years. But I'm not so sure that the digital SAT is a great test. All I care about really is helping my students get great scores on either test, because I am sure of this. When colleges say you will not be disadvantaged if you don't report scores, when they say they're optional, in the words literally of a Ivy League of a Ivy League admissions director, they were never optional. Someone's asking if classes are available remotely if you're away for 1 to 2 days. In the past, yes, we have made that an option. We're still trying to think through exactly what we're going to do, because we're now building separate structures in the office for people who are far away and want test prep. That's going to be largely through smaller tutoring relationships. We'll do our very best to make, as we have in the past, classes available remotely if you're away. We also will allow, if someone's away for 1 or 2 days, for you to make up what you missed by attending a live in-person class that's on a slightly different schedule. For instance, if you miss 2 days, Tuesday, Wednesday in the week, you could come on the Saturday class, and I teach the reading personally on the Saturday class. And the Saturday class will cover all the key concepts that we learned that week, but in a slightly speedier fashion. If someone misses a Tuesday class, they can always come to a Wednesday class. We have a lot of ways of making up what you would miss. I'm going to thank everyone for your time. Again, my email is ch@hamiltoneducation.com. If there's questions that you have and you haven't heard an answer, or I wasn't able to satisfactorily answer a question, please send me a message. I'll do my best to address it through email. Thank you very much for your time. I hope everyone has a good evening. Someone is asking one last thing. No, so a very important question. I'm going to just answer this. Someone says, doesn't it conflict with the PSA? Don't you want to know the PSAT score be faking the SAT? No, I would think you want to know what your score is before you start studying the SAT. So we know what you need to work on, and we know maybe what group of students would have similar questions. But 213 perfect scores, I would say 99% of them took the SAT or ACT in August, September, October, and then the last test they took was the PSAT. I would say if we go back 30 years, the PSAT was a test that you would take usually without much practice. And then in the fall, which is how I did it, I actually took the SAT in December of my senior year. You have a PSAT score to help you understand maybe what you should study in the summer between 11th and 12th. What I'm recommending is you get all of these tests out of the way between between August and October. And the PSAT in 11th is not a test you should take untutored, unstudied as a diagnostic. In fact, because the PSAT has such a high dollar value associated with it, I've had students earn $300,000 scholarships to USC or very nearly that. I would say the PSAT is not a test that I would want to take before. I want to take it after I've studied, and we will know probably within 20 points what you're likely to get on the PSAT. It doesn't conflict with it. I've heard rumors where people say, oh, no, you can't take the SAT or ACT before you take the PSAT. No, this is just not the case. That's a really important question. I'm glad someone asked that. I am going to say thank you very much to everyone, and I wish everyone a pleasant evening, and thank you for joining, and thank you for your questions.